consequences. Just like obedience, we've seen that obedience to God brings consequences. What are the consequences for obeying God, walking with Him? Read Psalms 91 again. Understand, what's true in one is true in the other. What's true in one is true in the other. You obey Satan, you need to be ready for the consequences. You need to be ready for the consequences. Obedience to Satan brings consequences. We need to understand this. Never doubt that for a second. That's honestly the problem that many have today, that they don't even realize they have. They blame God for things that the enemy is doing. Why? Because they have moved out from under God's shadow. They willfully chose at some point, at some place, God, that sounds good, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this instead. I'm going to do this instead. They blame God for things the enemy is doing because they have moved out from under the shadow of the Almighty. Church, understand the most troublesome of these rules relating to God granting free will to us as humans happens here. We live in a flawless world. We live in a flawless world. Why is it flawed? It's flawed because of sin. Sin's a problem. How many times have I said that? Sin's a problem. Can't get away from the sin problem. Each of us must acknowledge some things this morning. Some things in our lives that need to be acknowledged. Number one, we need to acknowledge that God has given us a free will. Now, acknowledge that God's given us a free will. Understand you have that free will. Your choices have, what is it? The writer of Deuteronomy says, I set before you life and death, blessing and cursing, therefore choose life. I think that's about Deuteronomy chapter 30. You hear what God says? He has set before us. That's free will. Life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life. Choose life. Acknowledge that He's given us free will. Acknowledge that He's given us free will. Number two, acknowledging that this is also acknowledging that many times that we've probably chosen poorly. You know what? There have been times in my life I can tell you that I've chosen poorly. And I paid the consequences for it. Brother, some of you are shaking. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Acknowledging that we've got free will, we also need to acknowledge that, you know what, we've made poor choices with that free will. We've made poor choices. Also, now acknowledging and understanding that as we do so, as we have made those poor choices, we have moved out from under the shadow of the Almighty. You hear what I'm saying? Those three things need to be acknowledged. We need to acknowledge those three things. Why is this so needful for us today? Why is it so needful for us? Well, number one, to exercise our free will and voluntarily place ourselves back under the shadow of the Almighty. You know what? If you want to come back under, and that's a good thing about our faith. We can, at one moment, we have that choice to move out. But you know, it's a good thing God didn't say, well, you've moved out from under my shadow. You're just lost. Get away from me. God doesn't say that, does He? My people, what's God say? Who are called by my name will what? Humble themselves and pray and seek my face. Turn from their wicked ways. Then I'll hear from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land. What did the Apostle John say? If we confess our sins, He is faithful and just. Forgive us our sins. Cleanse us from all unrighteousness. The same principle, same spiritual truth, both Old and New Testaments. Both Old and New Testament. Acknowledging we've made poor decisions, we've moved out from under the shadow of the Almighty. It's important because as we can exercise that free will and we can move ourselves back into alignment with God. Understand that. Understand that. You make a free will, you use your free will, and you've exercised your choice. You've brought yourself out from the alignment with God. God hasn't moved, you did. You did. So when we exercise our free will, we move back, we're realigning ourselves back into God's presence. Realigning ourselves back into God's presence. Exercising our free will, voluntarily placing ourselves back into the Almighty. Number two, we need to exercise our free will again and place ourselves. You know what? The best thing you can do, you're thinking, you know what? I don't want